Evening. Welcome to the Institute of Politics. I'm David Axelrod, the director of the IOP. Pleased to welcome Secretary Buttigieg back. I will say, if we gave out, you deal with the airlines, if we gave out frequent flyer miles for visits to the IOP, you could travel around the world several times, because we saw you as a mayor, we saw you as a candidate for president. Now you're back as secretary, and we're really grateful to see you again. Before one of our students formally introduces our guests, in a few minutes I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming events we have at the IOP and go over some housekeeping notes. On Saturday, May 7th, the Institute of Politics and the Chicago Humanities Festival will be co-hosting a program on building and maintaining diverse democracies with IOP Executive Director Zeenat Rahman, sitting right here, in conversation with Ibu Patel and Yasha Monk at the UIC Doran Forum at 4 p.m., so we invite you to attend that. On Monday, May 9th, Deputy U.S. Attorney General Lisa Monaco, who is, by the way, a graduate of the law school, will join us for a conversation with Chicago law professor Genevieve Lakier to discuss free speech, civil rights, and the role of the Department of Justice in an era of increasing partisan divisions. This will take place at the Ida Noyes third floor theater at 5:30 p.m. And on Tuesday, May 10th, New York Times reporter and Pulitzer Prize winning investigator David Fahrenthold will discuss the impact of modern political and investigative reporting in a conversation moderated by Marianne Ahern of NBC Chicago. That will take place at the Quad Club at 5:30 p.m. And we should point out that that event is in honor of the late David Broder, the great political writer for the Washington Post and the New York Times, and his wife Anne, great benefactors of the Institute of Politics, and also alums of the university. That will take place, I think, at the Quad Club at 5:30. Now the housekeeping rules. After tonight's moderated discussion, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. As usual, we'll give priority to the first questions to our students. As always, let me emphasize that questions are the things that end with question marks. If this is your first time at an IOP event, we especially encourage you to ask a question. A reminder, all are welcome to ask questions. This is in blue, highlighted in blue in the notes that were given to me, so it must be important. And as a housekeeping note, please make sure your phones are silent. We'll now hear formal introductions from Sophie Hare, a third-year student in college majoring in public policy. Sophie currently serves as the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board, on the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board, and previously served as a Speaker Series intern. Please join me in welcoming Sophie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this IOP Speaker Series event, Bridges, Broadband, and Babies, inside Pete Buttigieg's first year in Washington. My name is Sophie Hare. I'm a third year in the college majoring in public policy, and I serve as the Speaker Series chair of the IOP Student Advisory Board. In 2020, I had the honor of campaigning for Secretary Buttigieg's presidential campaign and traveling to Des Moines to witness his stunning victory in the Iowa caucuses. It is my honor tonight to introduce our guests, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and student moderators Ricky Holder, Connor Lee, and Hannah Dominguez. Secretary Buttigieg serves as the 19th Secretary of Transportation. He's the first openly gay cabinet secretary to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate, the youngest person to ever serve as Secretary of Transportation, and the youngest member of President Biden's cabinet. As the most powerful transportation secretary in U.S. history, Secretary Buttigieg has spent the past year getting his hands dirty to update and modernize America's decrepit infrastructure and push our nation to be more equitable, environmentally resilient, and industrially competitive. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Secretary Buttigieg served as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve and deployed to Afghanistan as a lieutenant. He also served 2 terms as mayor of his hometown of South Bend, Indiana, which earned him the nickname Mayor Pete, and ran an electric campaign in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. In 2020, he was also slated to be an IOP Pritzker Fellow, but his IOP residence, like all good things in 2020, was stomped on by COVID-19. Last but certainly not least, this past September, he and his husband Chasten adopted fraternal twins, Joseph and Penelope. Ricky Holder is a third year in the college studying public policy and Latin American studies. Originally from San Bernardino, California, Ricky served as an information systems technician in the US Navy from 2011 to 2017. He currently serves as a civic engagement co-chair on the IOP Student Advisory Board. Hannah Dominguez is a third year in the college from Johns Creek, Georgia, studying political science, Portuguese, and Spanish. She's involved in various Model UN organizations and serves on the board of the IOP's LGBTQ+ oriented spectrum cohort. Connor Lee is a second year from Wilmette, Illinois, studying political science and creative writing. He serves as vice president of campus and student life on the undergraduate student government and as a class representative on the college council. He is also the IOP Civic Engagement Finance Intern. Thanks again for joining us, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Secretary Buttigieg, Ricky, Hannah, and Connor.
So yeah, we just want to thank our good friend Sophie for that fantastic introduction. And we want to thank all of y'all for coming out tonight and joining us in what's sure to be a phenomenal discussion about bridges, broadband, and babies. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for joining us. The best part about having you here is you're a package deal. We got to meet your mother just a little while ago, so
right.
Delightful. And so we have so many topics to cover tonight, so I'll just launch into our first question, which is just catching up with you. Last time you were here, you were the mayor of the city of South Bend. You were a presidential candidate. It was just you, Chasten, Truman Buddy, got to shout out the dogs, against the world. And now you're the Secretary of Transportation and a father. So just talk to us about the transition to Washington and some of the challenges you've had to navigate with all these changes in such a short time.
Yeah, first of all, really excited to be here, and thanks to the IOP for having me and to all of you for joining. It's a lot. It's quite a change. And the bottom line is I have the best job in the federal government right now. At least I think I do, because I get to work on building the future. And so that when you have a job that's meaningful and exciting like that animates you. And what I didn't bank on was the other things in my life that were going to change. We'd hoped to become parents for some time, and we got a phone call after a few false starts, as happens to a lot of adoptive parents. But when the phone call came, it was less than 24 hours notice. And by the way, it was twins. And our whole lives changed. Chess and I were both traveling. We got on flights. I got on a flight. He got behind the wheel. We converged at a small rural hospital, and we're holding in our arms these two children who have just changed everything. And I'm like every sappy new parent that I've ever known. So forgive me on that. But it's been obviously an incredible thing. And it's refocused my attention and my understanding about my relationship to the world and to the future. And we're in this row house, 2 dogs, 2 dads, 2 kids, figuring out how to do that as all parents do. And meanwhile, figuring out how to do a job that is just full of purpose and energy and intention. And figuring out how to navigate this moment that we're all working through as a country, as a society. And just when you think things are sort of stable enough that you can take account of them for like a week, you check the news and something else seismic happens. And in that respect, at least, I think I'm in the same boat as just about everybody in this country.
Yeah, speaking next to specifically your role as Secretary of Transportation, there have been a couple of key pieces of legislation that have passed in the last year or so, which we know of. First is the $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was passed in November. There is also the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, which was passed in March 2021, aimed at helping the country recover from the pandemic. So regarding first the Infrastructure Act specifically, could you explain the role that the department played in its inception, its development, and will now play in its implementation across the country?
Yeah, so as a department, basically I work in a building full of people who have waited their whole lives for a moment like this. We're talking about legislation that is creating the largest infusion of funding into the American transportation system in most of our lifetimes. We're talking about the biggest investment in our interstate highway system since the interstate highway system was created, the biggest investment in Amtrak since Amtrak was created, the biggest investment in public transit ever, the most that we've been able to do for ports and airports. Obviously, it's just a colossal moment for U.S. transportation. Our role in shaping it was to try to provide the technical information to get it framed right, but also to make sure that it took shape in the right way. It's not enough to just throw money at roads or throw money at airports. Every transportation decision is also a decision about what kind of country we're going to be. And the choices that we make about how transportation shapes our climate, how it shapes the equity or lack thereof in our society, racially, regionally, socioeconomically, the physical safety of what it's like to move around our communities, that's all partly decided by how this bill was designed. So our focus was trying to make sure that it was as effective as possible, and then just, of course, trying to get it passed. A lot of phone calls, a lot of give and take, a lot of time in the Oval Office with the president, working with senators and members of the House from both parties to scope out where there would be a deal, because it really was important to the president, to the administration, to craft this on a bipartisan basis. And I know people scoffed. Some people did when the president came to Washington believing that we could do something this big on a bipartisan basis. The idea of a bipartisan anything law seemed far-fetched. But we were able to get a bipartisan infrastructure law through that will now allow us to make these investments. And now, of course, our order of business to actually make it happen, because it's one thing to pass the law and it's another to actually deliver the value, to build the things that we set out to build. And that's the focus of our department and will be for a very long time.
So continuing on with this discussion of infrastructure, I want to ask a Chicago-specific question. So many people on the south side of Chicago have been frustrated with the lack of reliable and safe transportation services. The Chicago Transit Authority's $2.3 billion Red Line expansion project is likely to begin in 2025, and that will have ripple effects that bring housing and retail businesses to the south side. So on the one hand, thinking big picture, how is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act going to support the city of Chicago? And then on the other hand, thinking more specifically about the south side, how will the Infrastructure Act support initiatives like the CTA Red Line expansion project?
So here's a great example of what I mean when I talk about how safety, equity, climate are all in play in every decision that we make. And I should start with a caveat that there may be applications that come in that we haven't made decisions on about what will get funded when. But one thing we can say, and I've been there, I've been to 95th Street, been on with the CTA leadership on the Red Line, is that we see what's at stake in providing great transit. From a safety perspective, transit is just a safer way to get around. We might get more into this later, but there is an absolute crisis in roadway deaths in America that we're working to fight. And so almost by definition, the more people take transit, the fewer deaths there will be in American transportation. Climate-wise, the number of cars that are not on the road when even a handful of people choose to take transit, have the option to take transit, is the kind of difference maker that's going to be, I think, as big a part of the story of how we confront climate change in transportation as the electric vehicle work that we're pursuing energetically. And then equity-wise, here's one way to think of it. There's a public housing community called Altgeld Gardens that's on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Roseland. There also, as chance would have it, is a community in Indiana close to South Bend where I live called Roseland. It takes as much time for somebody who lives in the city limits of Chicago, in the neighborhood of Roseland, to get to the Loop to do a job, if they have a job there, using public transit if they don't have a car, as it does to travel 90 miles from Roseland, Indiana, if you do have a car. So the implications of that are economic isolation for people who live in the city because they're not adequately served by transit. That's what the CTA is working to change. And what we're able to do is potentially provide more dollars, more resources to help them make that change. These are the things that have been talked about for a long time. They're the reason that there's been so much excitement about the possibility of infrastructure. Matter of fact, I would say this is one of the areas where I was, to be honest, fooled by the last administration. I actually thought they were going to do infrastructure. If for no other reason than everybody loves it and it would have been good for the economy. And there was a lot of talk about it, and obviously it didn't happen. That we finally actually got a big infrastructure deal through means a particularly great deal to those who have been left out by the infrastructure choices of the past. South Side transit expansion in Chicago is just one example of that.
Yeah, so this wouldn't be an Institute of Politics event without a little discussion of politics. So with the midterms coming up, if polls are to be believed, there's a general dissatisfaction in this country where a lot of Americans have not seen what the Biden administration has delivered for them. So my question for you is, how does this infrastructure package, how does what we're talking about now help counteract some of the concerns of the American people?
Well, again, first of all, it's the fact of its passage is a huge deal. In any normal presidency, in any normal time, that alone, certainly that and the rescue plan that you mentioned earlier, would stand as presidency-defining accomplishments. Trouble is, we're not living in ordinary times. The things that we're up against as a country, still working our way out of the COVID pandemic, dealing with the economic ups and downs that we have, the division in this country, the threats to our democracy, obviously mean that the bar has been raised incredibly high for any president and any presidency. But within this realm of infrastructure, we're ready to deliver now. Now, I should also say, by its nature, infrastructure takes a while to complete. Some of what we're doing is like building a cathedral. And we do need to have honest conversations about the process of delivering that and how it can take some time. But the process of delivering it, before we even get to enjoy the new infrastructure, is also immediately creating a lot of jobs. And one of the things we've seen is, even prior to this infrastructure bill fully turning into dirt moving on projects around the country, is an amazing drop in unemployment. 3.6% unemployment. And we're going to need to work to sustain that level of high employment. The infrastructure bill is part of how we're going to do that. So we're creating jobs. If we get this right, we're going to be creating wealth for a lot of people who have been left out of wealth creation in the American past. And we need to tell the story. Part of what I'm doing here, I just cut a ribbon on a transit center improvement in Joliet that's been years in the making. That is an example of what we'll be able to do a lot more of, thanks to this bill. But we need to, I think, make clear, with maybe a little bit of shamelessness, how these improvements came about, what it's going to take to deliver them, because they didn't just happen. And increasingly, the improvements you're going to see are not things that would have happened anyway. They happened because this administration came in. And where administration after administration, Congress after Congress, said they were going to deliver a big infrastructure package and couldn't, we actually have.
Thank you.
Yeah, so going along the same lines of political developments in lieu of the upcoming midterms, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some recent developments we've seen across the country. So first, according to the Supreme Court draft opinion, Roe v. Wade is likely to be overturned in the upcoming months. There's also an added concern that the same form of legal reasoning will be used to target LGBTQ+ rights, which have already been under attack through the passage of acts such as Florida's Don't Say Gay bill in recent months. So overall, our question is, what is your message to those affected by this regression, so to say, in politics that we're seeing? And what can be done to combat these attacks on fundamental human rights, especially ahead of these upcoming midterms?
It's the question of the day, isn't it? And I know there are people in this room and there are people around the country who are wondering and worrying what this turn means for them, what it means for all of us. I'd be lying if I said I had an easy answer on that. What I know is that for as long as I've been alive, and a lot longer than that, the general path of social and political life in America, and the general path of jurisprudence in this country, has been toward more freedom, more liberty, and more rights. And the question that I think has now been called is, did we just live to see the high watermark of liberty and freedom and rights in this country? The moment that will be remembered as the furthest we got before things started moving the other way? Or will that wave recede and we'll get even further? I think that's the question in front of us. So as somebody who believes in a woman's right to choose, as somebody who believes in the decision we made as a society, not just the decision that was made in the court, but I would argue a decision that we have made, at least a majority of us are on board with as a society, that even if we cannot come into alignment on the incredibly complex, difficult, philosophical, moral, and sometimes spiritual questions over things like where to draw a line when deciding about terminating a pregnancy, that we could at least agree on who gets to draw that line. I trust women to draw that line. For the last 50 years, America has trusted women to draw that line, has recognized that as a right. And now it would appear that the court is poised to take that understanding away. And of course, not only is that a source of fear for so many Americans, for so many women, but it raises the question about what other rights are going to be put on the table. I was with the Spectrum folks earlier. We didn't get a chance to really dig into this, but I know how this is hitting the LGBTQ plus community. Especially because unlike some rights that we have had for decades, that if you're an undergraduate age student, you have not known a country that didn't have those rights. Some of the rights that have come to the queer community are quite new. When I became mayor of South Bend, wasn't that long ago. The idea that I could be married, certainly the idea that I could be a confirmed cabinet member from Indiana, talking about my 2 kids that my husband and I are raising, would have been somewhere between unlikely and preposterous. And that possibility was secured by an action of the court. And so we know how fragile that is. And I think we're all feeling, in the face of our political institutions and our supposedly not very political institutions, our judicial institutions, having been shaky for some time, that this is not theoretical. It's been talked about in theoretical terms up until now, but this is not theoretical. This is going to shape what our lives are going to be like, as all political and judicial decisions, of course, do. But sometimes they get kicked around on political TV shows and sometimes in academic environments as if it's theory, and it's not, is it? It's how our lives are going to go. Then you have the agenda that has led to things like the Don't Say Gay bill, which, in my view, is a little narrower, though not less destructive, but a little bit narrower than the 40-year-long conservative political project that is culminating in what we're seeing perhaps about to happen to Roe. And what I mean by that is there's a more superficial political pattern that I think has driven some of the politics of the behavior of people like these people in Florida with the Don't Say Gay bill. And that is, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a culture war. So you got a political faction that really doesn't have a lot of answers for many of the questions that people are wrestling with. They love talking about gas prices, but they don't have an answer on gas prices. They don't have an answer on inflation. Many of them answered our call for bipartisan infrastructure work with a no. Haven't seen an answer on what to do about the price of prescription drugs. They voted against lowering that. Don't have an answer on what to do about the cost of childcare. Don't have a great answer on taxes. Actually want to raise taxes for the poor. That's a new one. I thought I'd seen it all. Then I saw Senator Scott's proposal to raise taxes for the poor. That's not great territory for them to be debating on. So what do? They find somebody vulnerable and pick on them, which at the moment is largely the trans community. And they find something to talk about which can go between the laughable, like is Donald Duck going to make your kid gay, to the incredibly dark, which is the suggestion that the very presence of someone who is gender nonconforming or trans or gay or lesbian or otherwise different, that the very existence of somebody like that is an adult subject, right? That if my kids in, let's say, a first grade classroom were to mention in passing that over the weekend they had a great time going with their dads to the zoo, that they would have somehow, by saying that, uttered something age inappropriate and get us really fired up about that fight. And it's just politics. It's motivated by just politics. So I guess what I'm saying is we're seeing a lot of overlapping patterns that are all pointing in the direction that the worst tendencies in human politics always have, which is to take rights and freedoms away and to make it harder for vulnerable people in the service of some imagined political gain. And there are two answers to that kind of thing. Two kinds of answers, I would argue. One answer is to argue against it and fight against it, which is what I do, and people who are involved in politics and public life go on television and do. And the other is to see to it that that is in fact not a way to gain power politically. Because of course the biggest test of any of these tactics isn't were they well argued, were they convincing? The biggest test of these tactics is did they work? And I'm going to be careful saying anything more about that because I'm here in my capacity as a federal official and I'm not here to talk about campaigns. But I will say just as a matter of policy and as a matter of the kind of political maneuvering that takes place among officials, certainly in Washington, ultimately, if things that hurt people help you get more power, people will continue to do them. And the rest is up to us.
So after discussing those pretty devastating developments, I do want to ask a more optimistic and hopeful question.
Good. I'm ready for a more optimistic and hopeful question.
I think we all are. So in 2020, you released your book called Trust. And one of my favorite quotes from that book is when you write, quote, "To love a country as to love a person is to love a flawed and exquisite creation, to see what is best in it, to be angry when it is not what it could be, precisely because you have seen glimmers of its greatness." This quote really struck me because it's very powerful and hopeful and optimistic, despite the fact that we've seen some pretty dark moments in the past few years. We've seen, a rise in violence against Asian Americans. We've seen the Capitol riots. We've seen almost 1 million deaths from COVID. But I'm wondering, what are some moments in which you've seen our country exhibit these glimmers of greatness, specifically during your time as presidential candidate and now as Secretary of Transportation?
Oh, that is a great question. So, first of all, our country has this really amazing, elegant quality in the way it was set up, which is its capacity to heal and redesign its own terms. And what I mean by that, among other things, is the capacity for constitutional amendments. We haven't seen any constitutional amendments come along since I've been in presidential politics. But I think we have seen a new level of openness to structural questions, not just policy questions, in our democracy, in our representative republic. And I think that, to me, that is a glimmer of greatness because America has often been at our greatest when we have reimagined how our government is actually going to deliver for people instead of just being stuck in the same pattern for 10, 20, 50, 100 years. I've also seen on some really important issues some things that are really encouraging. Mental health, the conversation about mental health, just in the 5 or so years that I've been involved in politics at a national level, has changed in a much better direction. We can talk about mental health in a way that, I'm not saying it's easier, we're over the stigma or anything like that, but we're in a much better place than we were in terms of a readiness individually and socially to talk about what people are up against with mental health, the principle that it should be as safe and as acceptable to talk about an experience with let's say, depression as it is to talk about a torn ACL. And I think we're on a really healthy We're on a really positive path there. I've seen the involvement of young people in politics and political processes. Obviously, I saw it as a candidate in a way that was really inspiring and moving. I've seen it before and since, where I think young people have come to understand the moral authority that they carry on many of the issues of the day. We certainly saw it in the response to the Parkland shooting and the way that that created not just a moment, but a movement. The way that a new generation of people is talking about climate change, that I think is really inspiring and encouraging. And it's all the more inspiring and encouraging. I know this is supposed to be the optimistic question, but I should say the context of it, among other things, that's amazing to me is that if you're college age now, the last real policy triumph, in my judgment, that you've seen, I guess would have been the passage of the ACA. If you're college age now, how old would you have been when that happened? Middle school, 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that? Okay. So if since then you've mostly seen policy failure and you still find it worth engaging and trying to make things better, that's a glimmer of greatness, I guess. That's a sign of determination and resilience to make things better than they are, instead of just accepting that things are always going to stay the way they are. And that's pretty inspiring I'd like to think I'm not that far out of college, but I guess I could say it's inspiring for an old-timer like me.
Yeah, so at the outset of Connor's question, we talked about love of country. And one radical expression of loving one's country is service to one's country, an identity that you and I share as we both served in the Navy, albeit in different capacities. And I know there are a lot of folks here tonight who are affiliated with the military community. And one challenge that we're struggling with in this country is the growing civilian-military divide. Yep. I know a lot of my friends, we express the belief that the military is the most talked about community, but the least understood, because it's so simple to do thank you for your service and move on your way. So my question for you is, you were one of the only presidential candidates in 2020 that served, and you were one of 2 in the cabinet. So how does your perspective as a veteran shape your approach to politics? And I would love to hear your thoughts about the growing civilian-military divide and how we can bridge that.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the military, the veterans are often more appreciated than understood. I don't know if that's been your experience, but certainly feel that way. And I'll tell you, the big thing that I bring with me is the attitude and the spirit of coming together across radical divisions and differences that I experienced. So ironically for the Navy, I got sent to a landlocked country, Afghanistan. As you know, the needs of the Navy, as they say, send you wherever Uncle Sam wants you to be. And a big part of my job was just driving. We called it military Uber. I was one of relatively few people qualified with on a certain kind of weapon in my unit, which meant that for my commander to go out, somebody had to go out with him, and it was usually me if we went outside the wire. And so I drove around a lot. And sometimes I would recruit others to drive with me, either around Kabul or on a somewhat riskier path between Kabul and Bagram Air Base. It's about an hour-long road trip. And the thing is, when somebody was getting in my car, they definitely did not care if I was a Democrat or a Republican. Were not in the least interested if I was going home to a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Couldn't have cared less what I thought about the divisive political issues of the day. They wanted to know if I was alert, if I'd had my coffee, if I'd read the briefings, if my weapon was in good shape, and if I'd trained well on how to use it. That's what they would have wanted to know. And I found people I had nothing in common with, and hadn't had that much time to get to know either. Like an exchange of salutes or maybe a handshake, and off we go. That we were trusting each other with our lives. And the truth is, we actually all trust each other with our lives more than we realize. We do it by participating in a democracy, and we do it in a lot of other ways. But I think, obviously, that kind of environment kind of puts a finer point on it that makes you really think about it. And what I found is that people who have served have, I think, that quality of being often capable of seeing through not just superficial differences, but profound differences to relate to people who are still fellow Americans. And that's a spirit I would like to see cultivated more, especially at a time like this. And across the civil-military divide, I guess what I'd like to see is that spirit brought more into the civilian world. And I don't say that in the spirit of a kind of milquetoast unity that we're all going to just look past our differences and easily get along. I mean a sense of purpose and a sense of being bound together in certain national projects. I would argue that the race to beat climate change is such a national project. I view the delivery of the infrastructure that we're undertaking as such a project, that are so compelling, so important, that people could, on the strength of a handshake or a salute, trust each other to become teammates overnight. And the more of that we can get in our country right now, the better.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So I'm going to transition to a topic that I'm sure is of interest to everybody in attendance, and it's about the future, particularly your future. So what are your future political ambitions? And if you're planning on making news tonight, do you plan on running for president again?
So I'll tell you exactly what's in my future. I'm going to Cleveland tomorrow, where we're going to look at workforce development for infrastructure. I don't mean to be flip. Look, I really mean it when I say I think I have the best job in the federal government right now. And as with any job, but especially one where you've been trusted with $500 billion, it's very, very important to do that job well. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for getting caught up in the political chatter. And I know that sounds like it's the correct answer to give, and I suppose it is. But it has the benefit of being true. I mean, we're trying to figure out how to reconfigure and improve every element of the transportation systems of the United States of America. Something that, honestly, at this level, no Secretary of Transportation has ever been given a chance with these kinds of resources to do. And I also know that if I ever find myself applying or running for any other job ever again, which I imagine I will need to because I don't expect to retire in my 40s, then once again, all that's going to matter is did I do a good job. So it's like 110% of my energy that isn't already going to trying to be a good dad, which is the most rewarding and demanding job I've ever had. And I'd be lying if I said I got that one figured out.
Well, if you are looking for a change of scenery, I know there's a spot opening up at the IOP.
Now that's an enviable job.
Absolutely. I know the guy, so I'll put a good word in for you.
Yeah. Good to know. If this doesn't work out, that could be a great option.
So if you do plan on running for president again, not saying you will, okay. But if you do, you'll have 2 new members on your team, Penelope and Joseph, than the last time that you did. So we'd like to ask, how has being a father affected you personally? How has having children changed your outlook on your current work and your future work?
Well, first of all, it's humbling, and I think healthy to be humbled in this way. Because your kids don't care, like, they need to eat, and the diaper needs to be changed. And just because I'm a little bit late and I'm on my way to see the president doesn't change the fact that they need to eat and the diaper needs to get changed. And also, just for those of you who, as I was 6 months ago, don't actually know much about the specifics of having an infant, I was not aware that they need to eat every 3 hours. That means they need to start to eat every 3 hours. And our kids were a little premature and needed, it could take about an hour and a half even, to eat. You had to kind of help hold them upright. And so anything else that you might need to do, like sleep or work or eat or laundry or wash all the bottles or figure out how to get them Social Security numbers or any of that. That happens in the other hour and a half in between the hour and a half that begins every 3 hours all day and all night, every single day. And the other amazing gift of becoming a parent is, I don't want to say you don't mind. It actually really can be crushing. but somehow you also don't mind. And up until 5 or 6 months ago, if I were to be vomited on, I would mind. And now it's just like, okay. And so it just cuts you down to size, right? And reminds you that your function, by the way, also occasionally the thought crosses your mind that you aren't just taking care of another human being, you are training your replacement, right? And that kind of just puts you in the human chain in a slightly different place and way. And it's the most amazing and beautiful thing. Every little, I'm going to sound like every other parent, and I know that's boring if it's not your kid, but like every little thing. Penelope is attempting to crawl, but she can only go backwards. So you can put a thing in front of her, and you can tell she wants to get toward it, and she knows that getting toward it involves moving knees and elbows, but she just hasn't put it all together, and so she goes backwards, and then she gets really mad, and then she cries, and then I pick her back up and put her back where she's supposed to be. And there's something about just life being reduced to its very basics, which is great, because I didn't know how I was going to do with the baby phase. I mean, I always maybe romanticized parenthood. I knew that it involved, a person being dependent on you. But I always thought of that in terms of like advice. And I'm sure we'll get there at some point, but that's not what they're looking for from me right now. It's not even close. And so I wasn't sure how I would do with the baby phase. I knew I'd be good once we got to the point where we could talk about books, but I didn't know how we would do in the just straight up baby, just they need to eat. I mean, every 3 hours. It's incredible. Now it's more like 4.5 hours. So look, it resets your relationship to the universe. It humbles you. It fills you with this kind of joy you didn't know that you had. It fills you with a species of terror that you didn't know that you had. And then to tie it a little bit back to politics and policy, it makes you realize in a different way what's so important, right? Like by 2050, they're going to be in their 30s. Did I do that right? Yeah. And 20s. We will have either succeeded or failed on something like climate change. And if all goes well, I'll be around for them to ask me either how we succeeded or why we failed. So that's like a different kind of deadline pressure than when all of these things are just kind of abstractly being thrown around. Like my actual kid is going to look into my actual eyes, Lord willing, and say, Dad, tell us about the 2020s. Like, tell us about the early 2020s when you got to the absolute last do or die moments on an issue like climate, and you pulled it off, or the alternative. And that changes everything too.
Okay, so this is going to be our last question, and then after this, we will turn it to audience questions. So kind of bringing it home here, our very own David Axelrod has said that some people get involved in politics because they want to be something, while other people get involved in politics because they want to do something. There are many students here who are watching today. What is your advice for young people who want to follow a similar path as you and not just be something, but rather do something to improve their community through public service?
Like many sayings of David Axelrod, that one's full of great wisdom. The first good bit of advice I can give is never to get overly interested in a job or an office, definitely an office, for the purpose of occupying it. Public service jobs are for something. They're there so that you can take the tools that are entrusted to you and use them to do something good. And oddly, I think sometimes that falls out of the conversation, largely because of the gamification of politics and the idea that just the attainment to the office is a prize. But of course, the attainment to the office is just being given that chance to take that office and do something with it. I would add that if you're more focused on what you want to do, you'll be more resilient to the ups and downs of winning and losing things. And you'll have a better sense of what to do, of course, when you do win. I would also add that a reason not to get overly hung up on a particular office is that you don't know what's actually going to happen in the world, and you don't know what's going to happen in your life, and you don't know when it's going to make sense to seek an office. So every time I've ever sought office, and by the way, several times I've decided not to, the process I went through was I looked at what was going on around the office and around the country or the constituency, and then I looked at what I had to offer. So when I was thinking about running for mayor, the issue in my hometown of South Bend was that there was a sense that the city had lost its energy. We'd lost our big employer, Studebaker, the automaker, 50 years earlier, and we're still getting over it. And above all, the big measure that was telling people that our city was maybe not even going to make it. We were on this list of dying cities that Newsweek put out. The biggest measure of that was we were losing our young people. And I thought, well, I'm a young person, and I care about this city, and I believe in it. And it turned out a lot of my friends felt the same way. And so it turned out that, and there were also some issues about whether the city could really be effective economically, and I'd studied economics, and I was working, among other things, in economic development as a consultant. I thought, okay, I have some skills and some stories and an identity that kind of matches this moment. And then if you think you see a match, you ask around, and your friends will tell you probably a number of different things. Hopefully, if they're honest, some of them will tell you you're out of your mind, and others will tell you to go for it, and you'll listen to them. But the only way you'll really know is to try it, and then the world will tell you pretty quickly whether you're onto something or not. But I wouldn't have known until the longest-serving mayor in our city's history decided to step away and not seek another term that moment would have arisen. It's not like I left town to go off to college thinking someday if I play my cards right, I can come home and be the mayor. And I definitely didn't think to myself, okay, here's the plan. 2 terms as mayor. We're going to have a good, strong economic turnaround. It's going to be the talk of Northern Indiana. And that's my moment, right to the presidency, right? It's not like that was the game plan. And what happened, of course, was a bunch of things, to me, to my city, to our country, that made it oddly seem like maybe this was the right moment, that my party was struggling to connect with the industrial Midwest, that a younger voice might have been called for, that there's just a lot of things that it seemed like maybe I could theoretically be the answer to, and then the only way to find out was to try, and then we caught on. I guess what I'm saying is, if you know what you're trying to achieve, not in terms of the title you're going to have, but in terms of what difference you're going to make, who knows what opportunities are going to come to you? Maybe you think the difference you're going to make is you're going to contribute to peace in the Middle East. And you might think that the way you're going to do that is going to be to take all the right steps to become the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. But then somewhere in your life, something happens and you wind up having a scholarly insight that leads you to become an academic. And you never live or work anywhere near the halls of power. You could be right here at the University of Chicago, but you wind up writing an article that changes the way people think about what the Middle East even is. If you're driven by purpose, then one way or the other, you're going to get to have that impact. If you're just trying to make sure you did all the things so that you could maybe get the job, you might get the job and have no idea what to do with yourself. And the good news about this advice, which I hope is good advice, and I hope is useful, is that it takes a little bit of pressure off you too. Because, look, you're at an elite university that has only, as I understand it, this environment has only become more of a pressure cooker since I found myself packing my bags for an elite university. And you were expected to have every twist and turn figured out because that was probably part of what was expected of you in order to even get here. And so that pressure has built up. And it's just not sustainable to go through the rest of your life with that kind of pressure over how you're going to hit the next wicket and take the perfect path. Not only that, if you're focused on that, you may not have your head up enough to see what the actual opportunity is to make the biggest difference in your life, which you might make by becoming president of the United States, and you might make in a viral moment having a conversation with somebody on a street corner. And you might make without anybody ever learning your name. So that's a very, very long-winded way of saying what David perfectly said in about 10 words, which is to worry less about what you're going to be, what title you're going to have, and just focus on the difference you want to make.
And with that, I think we will turn to audience questions now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Hello, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you for being here today. It's an honor to have you speak here. My question is around energy transitions. Approximately 5 years ago, Science Magazine published an article that was a roadmap to carbon neutrality by 2050, which, according to the IPCC, is their only hope at actually curbing climate change. The article had a set of massive milestones at the end of every decade from 2020 to 2050, including carbon taxes, fully phasing out fossil fuel transportation, creating an electrical grid that is able to compete with any sort of other form of transportation on air or ground. How does the federal government think about these sort of specific goals? And are we thinking in that 5, 10, 20, 30-year space of creating specific goals that are going to lead to this massive energy transition and how to effectively accomplish it? So I don't know if you could just speak to whether there are goals and which goals they are.
Sure, yeah, I'll speak mostly to the transportation goals because those are the ones that I work the most. But it is part of that broader path that you're talking about. And I think that the overall framework that we've been following, especially in the international context, is to keep 1.5 alive, right? To have a shot at keeping the warming down to 1.5 degrees by then, which, by the way, is still hugely disruptive, but avoids the most terrifying, irreversible consequences, we think, of climate change that we're already beginning to see right now. That involves some of the kinds of things you're talking about in terms of the overall transition in energy. Specifically with transportation, that means we've got to do several things to reduce the environmental impact and the emissions of trips, to shift trips from one mode to another. So every time somebody has the option of taking great transit, for example, or active transportation, if walking or biking is feasible where they live, and doesn't have to drag 2 tons of metal with them everywhere they go, even if that car would have been electric, that is, emissions-wise, that's going to be a big win, right? There is improving the nature of the trips. And even, over time, good planning means some trips that now don't make a lot of sense anyway in people's lives could be rendered obsolete. In other words, if you live in a well-planned community or neighborhood where you don't have to go wildly out of your way in order to shop relative to where you go to school or relative to where you work. There are very concrete goals attached to some of these things, especially the reduction of emissions from any given mode of transportation. So for example, just in our federal fleet alone, the president has charged us with going electric by 2027. By 2030, we've got to get half of the private fleet to be electric. Knowing that that's going to take a lot, but we'd still have a lot of internal combustion engines on the road. That's one of the reasons why my department has upped the ambition on CAFE standards, the fuel economy standards, because we're still going to have gas-burning cars on the road, obviously for a very long time. Cars that are sold today will be on the road for a very long time. So we have to make those maximally efficient. Then we have to make sure that the grid is actually built out to support these kinds of electric vehicles and to support other forms of electric transportation. Then we got to work on the harder to decarbonize sectors. So aviation has a goal of net neutrality by 2050. That is radically more challenging in some ways to imagine than it is today, because today you can buy an electric car and obviously you can't buy an electric wide-body jet. So what we do have are things like sustainable aviation fuels, which are in their infancy and a long way from being cost competitive. But we've launched a grand challenge on sustainable aviation fuels that my department's undertaking with the Department of Energy and actually agriculture, because biomass is part of that story, to look at what we can do to reduce the life cycle costs of fuels going into engines as we know them today. Stuff you could blend into fuel right now for an airplane that's taken off from O'Hare tomorrow, even while we're trying to figure out some of those propulsion challenges that we really do need to solve by the 2040s or 2030s in order to hit some of these goals. So what we have to see is across every sector, transportation, buildings, heating and cooling, right? The planning and design of cities, agriculture, right? Where there is carbon negative farming being talked about. Well, on some level, certain kinds of farming are already carbon negative. Remember, the original carbon capture and sequestration device is, plants. So there are things we can do there. But the right kind of soil management, the right kind of processes need to go into that. Deeply unsexy and profoundly important things like building materials, pavement, concrete, carbon negative concrete is a possibility. So not all of these things show up on the kind of timeline that you're describing in your question, because some of them depend on market or technical breakthroughs that we can't time. but we know how quickly we have to get through those breakthroughs in order to make it. And that's what some of the nearer term time hacks are. Our CAFE standards go through the model year 2026, and then we'll issue new ones, so that we know what we're supposed to be doing between now and 2026, and not just what we need to have achieved by 2050 when I'm explaining myself to Gus and Penelope. Thanks.
Hi, Secretary Buttigieg, thank you so much for taking the time today. My question is around a little bit of your personal background. So among the other things that you have done in your colorful resume, you have served as a management consultant for 3 years. And as someone who is majoring in business economics and also political science, I'm curious to hear what you perceive to be sort of the fundamental differences between business and politics, and what you think is fascinating about either one.
Yeah. So they're very different worlds, although they're very related worlds. Sorry, that sounded so, let me just explain. There's just a fundamentally different set of objectives in business. And obviously that's true, they're for profit. But what I also mean is that there's a little more clarity usually about how you set your goals and targets in business. That is actually one of the things I do think can and should be imported into politics and policy. A lot of times when people say, oh, we ought to run this government more like a business, actually no, and there's some reasons why not. But one area where I think that is true is in the ability to focus on certain measures of what's going well. Because fundamentally, any business enterprise, its objectives boil down to a number on a page, and if it went in the right direction, you're doing well, and if it went the other direction, you're not, right? Right or wrong, that is what a business is organized to do. And we struggle with a lot of overlapping and contested priorities in politics and public policy, but when it's about delivery, often you can do the same thing. So we do a lot around KPIs, so like business speak, key performance indicators, but sometimes across all of our really convoluted overlapping standards and procedures around road design, for example, right? I'm trying to boil it down into an incredibly simple and important number. How many Americans died on roads this year? And is it going to be more or less than last year? And there's a kind of focus we can bring that I think emulating some of the tactics and approaches that are used in the business world to focus teams could be really healthy. The other side of the coin is the purpose of politics and public service, correctly understood, I think, is to make the world a better place and to make people better off. It's not exactly the purpose of a business organization. In a healthy, well-regulated environment, business can function to do that by creating productivity and prosperity. But fundamentally, it's about delivering shareholder value. And technically, if you can deliver more shareholder value by making the world a worse place, and you're not breaking any laws, you have a fiduciary obligation to try to do it. I mean, there's all these interesting things going on with, corporate social responsibility and redefining, but fundamentally right now, that is the problem. And so, in a healthy system, business creates prosperity, but even then, the rewards are different. The reason I realized after working with some great colleagues and on some very interesting issues and problems, including things I thought would be not terribly interesting, like grocery pricing. And I wound up analyzing grocery prices, and that was how I learned about big data and opened up an analytical side of my mind that I didn't know was there because I was pretty much a humanities guy. But there was a moment when I got up from an afternoon of number crunching and went to get a cup of coffee. And as I was walking back to my seat in the little team room we had set up, I had this moment where I thought, I don't care. And that was when I knew it was time to get out of client service. Some people can motivate themselves by the desire, the professionalism and the desire to do a good job for their client. And that's more than enough to propel them. And they do a great job and they thrive. But if you're going out of your way to make yourself care, compared to public service where literally everything you do by definition matters to the prosperity of a community somewhere, and maybe to your country. If you're attracted to that sense of purpose, that could be a sign that that's really where you're going to be more energized. Might not be as lucrative, might not be as well regarded or respected, but it's got other rewards that there's just nothing like them.
So this next question is coming in from online. So
This is a question from Brian, who's watching online. What can the Federal Department of Transportation do to address inequity issues in education outside of the classroom?
Can the department inequity outside of the classroom? So if it's about access to, I'm trying to think about how we serve education equity outside the classroom. I mean, first of all, obviously just access to the classroom itself. So if part of the question is how do we connect people up to educational opportunity, it's making sure that you can easily, affordably, and safely get to whatever institution or community resource is going to help you educationally. I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. Am I missing something?
I think you got it.
Okay. I mean, look, there are also some really interesting angles about how, well, actually, no, let me stay with the first just to put a finer point on it. I was in Baltimore where we're doing an East-West connector project to help connect transit, and the mayor was there, and it was a bit like the story I was sharing from the Roseland neighborhood of Chicago. He told me it took him more than an hour to get to school using transit. And I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that it had taken me less than an hour to get to Baltimore from Washington that day. That does put a huge amount of pressure on your ability to learn. And so that's something else from outside of the classroom that penetrates into your success inside the classroom. Last thing I'll say, and again, I'm not sure if this is where Brian was headed, but it's on my mind a lot. It's why I'm going to educational programs tomorrow in Cleveland. I was at this transit tech center that they have in a high school, basically in Brooklyn. Well, it is a high school, but the students learn how to work on everything from electric vehicle maintenance to fixing subway cars. And they're going to be 2 out of the 4 years they need into an apprenticeship when they emerge, and there's going to be really good paying jobs waiting for them. So I guess the other thing that I think is relevant to education, or at least to skill building, is that in order to get the job done, just in order to build the stuff we need to build as a country, we can't leave any talent on the table. And there are a lot of students out there who might not even know that a future in construction or transportation is for them. And that could be anywhere from helping to dig out the trenches where we're going to put the fiber for the broadband to engineering PhDs that are going to help us build the next generation of air traffic control. But we need those kinds of skills, and we are investing directly and indirectly in cultivating those kinds of skills. And if we get it right, that actually will have helped raise the educational level of the country to get ready for this national project, which is delivering all the infrastructure.
Hi, my name's Abby, and I'm originally from DC. And so when you were talking about the transportation bills that you were working on, I was just wondering how they could help push back or at least diminish some of the effects of gentrification that can happen, like not only in DC, but just across the country as well. And like how, just talking a little bit more about like how it's really specifically addressing that.
Yeah, thanks. We think a lot about this, especially because we know there's a danger of making it worse, right? Sometimes when you make transportation more fluid into certain neighborhoods, you have the benefit of connecting them, but also that almost immediately makes them accessible for others who are prepared to pay a higher price. And so much of gentrification is about affordability. But because gentrification is connected to affordability, that also means that if we can increase the affordability of living in a community in general, we can take some pressure off what I would call the combined housing and transportation budget. So policymakers often think of housing as a totally separate category from transportation. We have different departments in the federal government that worry about it, right? But a family doesn't pay the transportation costs of their family 1 month and then the housing costs another month. For a low-income family, you combine housing and transportation, that adds up to about 40% or more of their income. And it's one of the things that will force a lot of families to either live in unaffordable living so that they can have access to work, or to live ridiculously far away from work in order to be able to afford housing. And another heartbreaking thing is when I talk to someone who explains that, and this, I remember one person in particular advocating for commuter rail to where she lived, saying, I'm not the parent that I want to be because of the way my commute works. I just can't be there for my kid. And so I think if we get these things right, and I talk often with my counterpart, Secretary Fudge, in Housing and Urban Development about how we make communities more livable through a thoughtful approach to how both housing and transportation are built. And as you know, often, especially with affordable housing provisions, you can very specifically and intentionally ensure that neighborhoods that people aren't priced out of their own neighborhoods as the economic tide rises, that we can weave transportation into that to make sure people are connected to opportunity and get to stay right where they are. And that the character of a neighborhood and the life of a neighborhood is sustained. So there's an opportunity as well as a risk here, and it's part of what we mean when we talk about equity in American transportation.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everybody. That was the last question. So I just wanted to say thank you to Secretary Buttigieg. I think, the mission of the IOP is to inspire action, inspire thought, and spark a passion for public service and meaningful dialogue and active engagement in our democracy. And I think that it really resonated today when you said that the determination and resilience that you see all these young people have to make things better, despite maybe evidence proving that to the contrary. And so, for those of you who are students in the audience, I hope you left feeling inspired, and I hope that you'll engage with us, engage with the Institute of Politics, whether it's coming to our speaking events. Our powerful crew here of interviewers are all a powerful demonstration of our student leadership. So please join me in thanking Ricky Holder, Hannah Dominguez, and Connor Lee. You guys did a fantastic job. And I'll ask you in closing just to stay seated for a few minutes while the secretary exits the room. Thank you all for being here today.
Can I just say one other thing? Sorry, just real quick. Just to leave you on a high note, or a note of empowerment. So a lot of attention is being paid to what decisions will be made in my building and cases where applications come in and we're picking and choosing projects. But the truth, and that's a huge part of our responsibility, but the truth is the bulk of the hundreds of billions of dollars that we're funding transportation choices on, that will decide safety, equity, can affect things like gentrification, will definitely affect things like climate, are actually being made at the state or at the local level. And this is really important to understand for young people in particular who, look, you're going to be living with everything we're about to build for the rest of your life. And so it's very important, especially for those who are planning to be here for a long time, that we get this right. Most of those decisions are being made closer to home than you might realize. I was in front of the Senate Commerce Committee yesterday. In order to testify in the Congress federally, you actually have to be invited, right? For better or for worse, I was invited. But in a city council meeting or a planning board meeting, or even a lot of state legislative committee processes, a lot of times you just show up. And so I would just leave you with that understanding that the dollars that are going to come from my building, the buildings where those choices are being made are a little closer to you than you might realize. And I hope if you care about, even if you're not a transportation buff or nerd like me, if you care about the things that are decided by this or affected by this, safety, climate, equity, jobs, the way the future looks, you have more power than you think to shape that. So I just didn't want to leave without saying that. But again, thanks so much for having me. And really enjoyed it. Hey, nice job.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Hey, thanks a lot. Nice job.